Lee County in New Mexico boasts of being the #1 county in the United States when it comes to oil production. But thousands of wells here in the state and across the US now sit idle. These orphaned wells can pose a significant and potentially deadly threat. Abandoned and often forgotten, but idle oil and gas wells pose more than just an idle threat.
This valve is leaking as well, so what we're going to do is we're going to rig up onto this now and we're going to go ahead and start to measure what that gas is.
Drilling at this well here in Hobbs, New Mexico stopped more than 5 years ago. When production slows, wells like this cease to be profitable and are often abandoned. They're considered orphaned if there's no owner or a fiscally viable operator to plug them. Testing reveals this well is a super emitter, meaning it's still releasing high levels of methane gas into the atmosphere.
Methane, because one of the reasons why it is so impactful to the environment is that it doesn't allow the heat to escape.
Curtis Shuck has worked in the oil and gas sector since the early 1980s. But in the summer of 2019, he encountered his first orphaned well and immediately adopted the cause of plugging sites like this. His Well Done Foundation helps identify and seal wells here in New Mexico and over a dozen other states nationwide.
What happens is these wells start out and they produce, and then they start to produce less and produce less. Companies will take and they'll sell them or transfer them from one company to another, to another, to another. And so it starts off maybe as sort of a major player, and by the time it gets to the condition you see behind us here, it's like mom and pop oil.
Plugging a well with cement can cost tens of thousands of dollars, too much for many smaller operators. The Well Done Foundation acts as a facilitator, working with state regulatory agencies, landowners and plugging crews to identify, monitor and help stop them spewing harmful gases. According to some experts, roughly 14 million Americans live within 1.6 kilometres of documented orphaned wells. The release of methane gas can be an explosive risk, while high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide can be deadly. New Mexico is the second largest oil-producing state in the US, with over 100,000 wells tapping into the oil and gas-rich Permian Basin. The energy sector fuels much of the local economy. Many of these wells are decades old, and some communities have been built up around them. Environmental advocates say this brings risks of prolonged exposure to things like volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, which can be carcinogenic or cause other health problems. Kaylee Shoup is with the environmental advocacy group Citizens Caring for the Future. As well as running campaigns including distributing air purifiers, the organisation also works to educate people about the risks of prolonged exposure to things like VOCs.
They often just refer to these emissions causing climate change and warming the climate, methane emissions. And so we're always just trying to remind folks that, these emissions come with other things like VOCs and nitrous oxides, and this really can harm people's health along with the climate.
The risks presented by an orphaned well can be measured, but figuring out how to stem the wider issue is a bigger unknown. The last operator of a site is obligated to seal it up, but many wells are either abandoned, no longer controlled by a responsible party, or are owned by a firm without the financial means to close it. New Mexico has been plugging up to 50 wells a year, and more than $40 million has been pumped into the state through the Federal Infrastructure and Jobs Act to boost cleanup efforts. Officials say the state is now on pace to plug around 150 wells per year. Lawmakers in the state recently failed to pass legislation to try and unlock more funds for cleanup operations. Oil and gas firms can currently cover the liability for their active wells for $250,000, just enough to plug about 2 of them. Bill 133 would have raised the cap for large companies to $10 million.
The states, federal government, and operators are all going to have to come up with additional resources to address this issue. Otherwise, the legacy that will be left behind are sort of rusting derelicts in the desert.
Some fear plugging efforts are currently just a drop in the bucket. The problems posed by orphaned wells aren't contained to the state of New Mexico. The issue runs far deeper. Experts say there are more than 1,700 documented orphaned wells in New Mexico alone, and over 125,000 nationwide. But if you take into account undocumented wells, some analysts say that figure could exceed 1 million. In 2021, the bipartisan infrastructure law earmarked $4.7 billion to shutter thousands of wells nationwide. Analysts say over the past year, those funds helped plug around 6,000 wells, with tens of thousands more to come. But wells are still being abandoned nationwide.
California has a ton, especially in Los Angeles, which is actually kind of wild.
Adam Peltz and the Environmental Defense Fund work to help use that federal cash injection to help secure wells across the country.
There are around 200,000 or 300,000 idle wells in the United States right now, and hundreds of thousands of more very low producing or marginal wells, all of which are at high risk of becoming orphaned soon. Unless operators are setting aside $50,000, $75,000, or $100,000 per well to plug the wells, we're kind of in trouble.
Several states have tightened laws to address the issue, but some analysts say more creative solutions are required to further incentivize plugging.
And that's where I think the whole international carbon market could help with that, provide incentives, even doing things like carbon insetting on, say, LNG exports to plug wells to, neutralize the carbon impacts from those LNG exports to do things. And there's so many different things that we could do.
Well, you guessed it, folks.
Experts say orphaned wells are an issue for countries around the world, including in Southeast Asia. Curtis Shuck and the Well Done Foundation use social media to try and raise awareness and educate people about the severity of the issue. With enough pressure, advocates hope that real change is in the pipeline.
California may be better known for Hollywood and Silicon Valley, but it also produces the 7th most oil of any U.S. state. Around 70% of that oil comes from here in Kern County in Central California, about a 2-hour drive from Los Angeles. The oil and gas industry is critical to the economy of the region, creating jobs, tax revenue, and in many ways, the local identity. But as California seeks to reduce its dependence on oil, the clock is ticking to keep the county from becoming an area of dying oil towns.
Oil is a way of life in this part of California. Its presence underneath the ground, made clear by the wells that dot the landscape, the name of a local high school's sports teams, in the monument built to honor oil workers from past generations.
We are an oil town, and we always have been. Kern County was once the largest oil-producing county in the continental United States.
But the state of California isn't very friendly to oil these days. California's governor, Gavin Newsom, a Democrat with presidential aspirations, has staked out a position as someone not afraid to take on big oil in the battle against climate change. He's put forward a plan to phase out oil drilling completely by 2045.
For decades and decades, the oil industry has been playing each and every one of us in this room for fools. They've been buying off politicians. They've been denying and delaying science and fundamental information that they were privy to, that they didn't share or they manipulated.
The state's battle against big oil and the climate warming emissions produced by burning oil is now playing out in oil-dependent towns like Taft. The state has made drilling permits harder to come by, among other restrictions. That's led to a decades-long decline in oil production, hitting the local economy hard.
There's just a lot of regulations and hoops you got to jump through for these companies like Chevron, etc. So it just discourages companies from drilling and producing more oil because it's not as profitable. They would just rather move out of state.
Nearly 30% of Taft's residents now live below the poverty line, more than double the national average.
I was born and raised here, and in the 80s it was booming. I mean, you made the money. And out here now, you can barely ever see any work rigs or anything. So yeah, it's declined a lot.
Since 2015, the town has lost more than a quarter of its population. For Taft's mayor, it's a bit of a paradox. His town is struggling, and yet global demand for oil reached its highest level ever last year. Oil consumption in California has also gone up. Increasingly, that oil just comes from other countries.
To live as a human being takes energy, and that will not go away, no matter what arbitrary date anybody chooses to bring forward. When we stop needing oil and gas, that's when we should stop producing oil and gas.
But for environmental justice advocates, the reckoning is long overdue. California's Central Valley has some of the worst air quality in the country, with major highways running through the region and a large agricultural sector. Living near oil and gas extraction sites poses health risks too, due to issues such as abandoned wells that often continue to spew harmful gases.
We don't have to live this way. We can have clean air, and we should have clean air. Oil doesn't have to be our way of life, and there doesn't have to be an oil well every few feet here, and in areas by schools and by houses and where people are living and breathing. Unfortunately, a lot of these oil projects do happen near the poorer communities, the working communities, and the ones who are least likely to defend themselves legally.
Kern County has diversified heavily into renewables, producing more renewable energy than any county in California. In the past 2 decades, it has brought in billions of dollars of public and private investment for projects like large-scale wind and solar farms. But the continuing decline in oil production has people looking for answers about how this area can prosper without one of its biggest industries.
Many here see a future in the growing industry of capturing and then storing carbon underground, which can often be done in depleted oil fields. The Biden administration has set aside billions of dollars to fund projects like these, but there remains a lot of uncertainty about large-scale carbon storage.
County officials are promoting a carbon management park, which would produce energy through renewable sources and then also capture excess carbon.
If we can attract, without even trying to, $86 billion of investment over 15 years, then I think we can invest $100 billion over the next 10 years for carbon management. And we can become the carbon management center of California.
WISPA priority issues.
But environmentalists here remain deeply skeptical of who will profit from this. They see it as a way for oil companies to remain entrenched in the region. The oil giant Chevron, for example, has already put forward a carbon capture proposal.
This facade and this false solution of the, carbon capture and sequestration is something that's being done to line the pockets of industry, really.
We're resilient people here.
One thing everyone seems to agree on, though, is that unless something changes, time is running out for the oil towns.
It's just a different place.
Different place. Where I live, it's a road that leads out to the oil fields. When I moved in that house 31 years ago, there was traffic all day and in the night. Now, you go out and it's quiet.
Like you mentioned the restaurants, we used to have to stand in line to get in a restaurant here. But there's plenty of seating now, so our oil fields are very good paying jobs, but we don't have the jobs anymore.
There is a lot of pride in the history of oil here and what it did for the region. But as the tide continues to turn against fossil fuels, especially in this state, the oil industry may soon be a relic in California, leaving many to wonder how towns like this can find a way to keep on going.
Daylight is breaking in Zulia State in northwestern Venezuela. It's here where the country's oil first erupted in 1914, transforming the state and its capital Maracaibo into oil giants, known worldwide for their oil reserves. Venezuela quickly became one of the most prosperous economies in Latin America. By 1950, Zulia accounted for more than half of the country's GDP. For many decades, the oil industry was the main source of employment and revenue for the country. But not anymore. This one-time oil boom town has been in economic free fall since 2013. 5,000 wells were operational at Lake Maracaibo in 2002. Today, most oil rigs have been shut down, with just a few still actively drilling. Production, which used to reach 3.3 million barrels per day, is now down to 700,000 barrels. Falling oil prices, mismanagement, corruption, and US sanctions have all played a part in the meltdown of the industry. And workers living in nearby oil facilities are among the most affected. 60-year-old Kelly Orsian is proud of his work at PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned company. He lived through the glory days of the Venezuelan oil industry, but also witnessed its decline over the last 2 decades.
Se siente una profunda tristeza al ver en las condiciones que está esta PDVSA, que en nada se parece a la PDVSA que yo conocí en el 86. Una PDVSA que verdaderamente le dio alegría, bienestar a todo un estado como el estado Zulia, a toda una comunidad como esta, la comunidad maravina, la comunidad de la costa oriental.
The pensioner says he dreamed of a peaceful retirement, but the country's inflation has hit his life savings. Working in PDVSA used to be appealing for the families in the area, but that's no longer true.
Nuestros sueños se apagaron. Nuestros hijos ya no preparamos ni ilusionamos a nuestros hijos para que puedan trabajar en la industria como lo hacían nuestros padres. Ya lo que queremos es que nuestros hijos se vayan.
A few meters away from Kelly's home, the coast of El Bajo is covered with petroleum. Oil spills happen frequently due to the lack of maintenance on pipelines, causing extensive environmental damage and harming fishing communities. Jordi Vicuña is a 34-year-old fisherman who cannot sail today. His nets are covered with oil residue.
Porque el petróleo que se está perdiendo es un petróleo que sirve para exportarlo, que sirve para hacer divisa, que sirve para medicamentos, para alimentos, para trabajo.
The decline of the country's main industry has had a ripple effect. Commercial establishments have closed in what's now become a ghost town. And many homes in Maracaibo and Zulia State are currently for sale.
Years of economic crisis has hit Venezuelans hard, but so have failures in basic services such as water and electricity. Maracaibo has been one of the hardest hit with unexpected and prolonged blackouts, which is why many have decided to leave.
Coping with such blackouts have become part of the daily routine for 81-year-old Zoraida Bracho. At her home in Maracaibo, the electricity goes out at least once a day. The country's power grid is failing and has received little investment. For more than a decade, power outages have been a frequent occurrence, affecting families and reducing productivity.
Es muy difícil
especialmente aquí en Maracaibo, porque aquí hay muchísimo calor. Entonces, ¿qué tienes que hacer? Comprar agua, si es posible, si tienes cómo.
And despite sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, the state also suffers severe shortages of gasoline. Residents must wait for hours in long lines to fill their gas tanks. The city is filled with hungry families facing food insecurity. 6 in 10 households find it difficult to provide 3 regular meals a day. Elizabeth Cohen lives with her husband and 3 children in Altos de Milagro Norte, one of Maracaibo's poorest slums. The 41-year-old mother is struggling to put food on her table and pay the rent.
Porque ahorita no tengo ni siquiera para un pañal para mi hijo. Ni comida tengo para mis hijos. Todo es caro, todo es en dólares. El bolívar está devaluado. O sea, no puedes, o sea, no te alcanza. Que te ganes $20, $30 semanales. No te alcanza.
This grinding poverty has been driving an unprecedented exodus from Venezuela. UN agencies estimate that about 7.7 million Venezuelans have left the country in recent years.
According to a recent survey, around 1 in 3 Venezuelans over the age of 18 are considering or planning to leave the country in the coming months.
Oil sanctions imposed by the United States since 2019 have worsened the odds of improving the local economy, deepening the deterioration of the quality of life for Maracaibo's residents. Now, after years of decline, its position as Venezuela's most important oil city remains only in the memories of those who have stayed behind.